Today, I'm going to talk about the 5 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. I present many of these ideas in my book, Freud for the 21st Century. And the 5 main concepts I'm looking at, which I believe structure the vast majority of psychoanalysis, both the thought and the practice, are the pleasure principle, the primary processes, the unconscious, transference, and the reality principle. So I'm going to go over each one of these concepts separately. First, I want to talk about this idea of threshold concepts. So a threshold concept is an idea or a theory that is often counterintuitive. And the threshold is once you know this concept, it's hard to think without it. And these concepts, these threshold concepts, serve to structure any discipline. And we can consider them to be frames for understanding. And I see them almost as a litmus test. So either you understand Freud's theory of the unconscious or you don't. And theories in general and concepts, threshold concepts, rely on abstraction and generalization. And so it's not about relativism in a sense like, oh, people have different ideas of what these concepts mean, or they can mean different things in different contexts. Fundamentally, the threshold concepts of psychoanalysis that I'm going to be discussing are universal in the sense that they can be applied to all situations and all people. So the first concept that Freud introduces is the notion of the pleasure principle. And I think most people misunderstand this essential concept. So one thing that Freud does very early on in his work is to really distinguish human sexuality from evolution by basically arguing that humans are not driven by the process of reproduction, that sexuality is often excessive and that it's not tied to a single object and that that object can be substituted over time. And so there's a distinction between instincts that we find in other animals where it's a pre-programmed by natural selection to pursue a certain object. And with humans, we have what we call drives, and drives are open to transformation and change. They can be fixated, but the object can be replaced or substituted. But Freud's fundamental idea is the goal of pleasure is to avoid unpleasure. So it is almost a double negation. And the idea is that as human beings, our primary drive is to avoid mental and physical tension. So this places psychoanalysis in opposition to evolutionary psychology and neuroscience, which is often fixated on notions of survival of the fittest and of the solution to problems and to reproduction. It's important to realize the term of enjoyment that is used a lot when the French term that Lacan uses a lot, jouissance, is used. Enjoyment as orgasm is itself an indication that it's a release of tension. So the goal of sexuality here is to release physical and mental tension. And there's this inherent drive then to escape feelings of guilt, shame, responsibility, and reality. And we'll see how this is achieved. And the clearest way of thinking about this is if we look at addictions. On one hand, you can think of them as the pursuit of pleasure, but they often lead to self-destruction. And driving addictions and drives, we find desires, which Freud early on defines as unmet needs. But we also have desire, as Lacan indicates, as tied to the transgression of social norms and social laws. But the key takeaway point is that the foundation of the pleasure principle, which drives humans, is to escape all mental and physical tension. And so there's this fundamental law of inertia that Freud posits. The second major principle that he develops And this is first really seen in his Project for the Scientific Psychology, which he wrote in 1895, but he never formally published. And he argues that the first way that humans satisfy the demands of the pleasure principle is through hallucination. And he indicates that this is an automatic process that relies on substitution and association. And so, as Lacan stresses, the use of symbolic substitution and association is very similar to what we find in poetic language, and that there's a certain, what he calls the play of the signifier or of symbols and representations. But the key idea behind the primary process is that in our minds, we have this fundamental way of thinking, which is irrational, unintentional, and indirect. And so that we see this in clearest way in dreams, hallucinations, and in psychosis that are fundamentally based on what Freud calls projection, meaning a internal representation, a mental representation is confused with the perception of the external world. So basically, our thoughts are projected onto the external world, and we see that as an indication of reality. Now, this is very similar to what Descartes says right before he says, I think, therefore I am, which is called the cogito, I think. He says right before he makes that famous statement, he says, I could be dreaming now or I could be awake. But the only thing I know for sure is that in both states, I am thinking. So Descartes, like Freud, first defines thought in terms of the inability to distinguish between dreams and reality. So this indicates that our minds are able to transcend reality. This is often called mind over matter. And as Freud indicates, when we're dreaming or when we're hallucinating, Freud says the ego is put to sleep and there is a deprivation of external perceptions. And we see this, for instance, when someone goes in a sensory deprivation tank and they start to hallucinate. Without the testing of external perceptions, the mind is able to regress to the level of the primary processes. So we can think of the primary processes in their extreme form as hallucinations, but there is a spectrum that moves from hallucinations to thought itself. So all thought and consciousness is ultimately a form of projection. So in the Project for Scientific Psychology, Freud presents this basic narrative that helps to structure many of these concepts. He says the first thing a baby does when it has an unmet need, meaning a desire, is to hallucinate a previous scene of satisfaction. So this is where we find the primary processes and projection and hallucination. Freud says when that does not fulfill the infant cries out. And here we enter into the next stage with the concept of transference. So the child cries out, and when the parent or caregiver responds to the cry of the child's cry becomes what we call a demand. And what is going on is the child is crying out due to the desire, the unmet need. And then when the parent or caregiver fulfills or answers that cry, then the other person takes over responsibility for the pleasure principle. So this way, people are able to satisfy the demands of their drives and the pleasure principle by getting other people to help them and to give them the fundamental desire, as Lacan indicates, is the desire based on the demand for love, understanding, and recognition. So when the baby cries out and the parent or caregiver responds, that response turns the original desire into a demand, and that demand is for love, recognition, and knowledge. And so what we find in psychoanalysis is when a patient comes for analysis, they have a fundamental demand, and that demand is for the other person to understand them, to recognize them, and to love them. And in the process of psychoanalysis, since the analyst doesn't directly respond to the demands of the patient, it is through this non-response that the patient is able to see what they're really looking for and what's behind their fundamental demand. Now, in this relationship of transference, it sets up a opposition between the helpless subject and the all-powerful other. And interestingly, later on in his career, Freud compares this relationship between the helpless subject and the all-powerful other to the relationship of hypnosis, which was the first form of therapy that he used. And he said in hypnosis, the patient is in the position of the helpless subject, and the hypnotist is the all-powerful other. And then Freud goes on to say, we find the same relationship in love relationships, especially passionate love relationships, where the lover becomes subjected to the power of the loved object. We see this same relationship in the church and the army, in these social structures, and in political rallies, where basically people submit to the leader who's now been put in the position of the object or of the hypnotist. And the people following the leader of the group act as if the leader has hypnotized them because they suspend their reality testing and they regress to the relationship between the helpless subject and the all-powerful other. And for psychoanalysis, this key concept of transference represents the essence of all social relationships. So at the bottom of social organization and social structure from a psychoanalytic perspective is this hypnotic relationship between the all-powerful other and the helpless subject. And this sets up a type of relationship that later forms the ground for what we can call a victim fantasy, which is that subjects find their identity as victims by replicating this relationship between the all-powerful other and the helpless subject. So the next fundamental concept, which is often confused with the primary processes, is the unconscious. And the key idea here that Freud presents, and which I think really is the litmus test of whether people understand psychoanalysis or not, is that the unconscious is based on repression. So it's not based on just the fact that we're not aware of things or that things happen automatically, because that happens on the level of the primary processes. Repression has to do with self-lying, lying to yourself. And this means you have to be self-divided. Sartre argued against the unconscious. He said, how is it possible for you not to know yourself? If there's anything that you know yourself. That consciousness is always aware of itself. So how can you have something that you yourself hide from yourself? Well, Freud said this is actually the foundation of neurosis. Neurosis is founded on the process of lying to yourself. Now, we lie to ourselves in order to escape feelings of guilt, shame, responsibility, and anxiety, and to protect our self-image and what Freud called the ideal ego, and to make sure that our ideal ego is recognized in a relationship of transference by the ideals of others, the ego ideal. And we see this the clearest in narcissism and obsessive compulsive disorder, where there is a constant demand for others to recognize the person's goodness and their purity. And we see this in the concept of virtue signaling. So the reason why someone needs to, say, wash their hands all the time, or to prove to other people that they're good that they're good by posting good images of themselves on Facebook. Those desires are driven by the need of people to have their good self recognized by others in order to prove to themselves that they are good. And so, one reason why someone would continuously wash their hands, the idea is that they're trying to purify themselves. And they're trying to purify themselves because they're trying to repress or hide from themselves their own aggressive desires and their own unconscious superego. So the idea here is that we feel guilt and shame and we internalize the norms and laws of society. But in order to prevent ourselves from having a negative self image, we have to repress the superego, and this places the superego into the unconscious. And Freud adds, whenever we repress something, that material becomes shaped by and reshaped by the primary processes. So they undergo a process of substitution, association, and displacement. And we see this clearly in hysterical symptoms, in obsessive compulsive inhibitions, and in phobic anxiety. So the final concept is the reality principle. And Freud uses this concept primarily to say that there is an alternative to the pleasure principle, but also he wants to introduce his theory of how analysis actually works. And so the concept of free association, the idea that people are supposed to speak without censoring themselves, is dependent on the notion of analytic neutrality. So by the analysts suspending their judgments and not judging the patient is supposed to learn how to be neutral in relationship to their own mental processes, thoughts, and feelings. So the idea is by not judging the patient is able to not judge themselves and therefore fully express everything that they have in the past repressed. And this idea of neutrality is a necessary but impossible ideal, meaning like it's never possible for the analyst to be completely neutral, and it's never possible for the patient to speak without judgment or censorship. But this is the ideal that drives the process. And part of this is the idea of not responding to the demands of the patient. And so by not satisfying the fundamental demand for knowledge, love, and recognition, the patient is able to discover what this demand means to them and how this demand has been derived. And so the idea of the reality principle in psychoanalysis is that through free association, there is the ability to move beyond transference, the pleasure principle, and the primary processes. And a key idea that Freud has is the notion that once something has been a memory, it can never be completely effaced. And that's why we find the return of the repressed in symptoms and in dreams and in fantasies. It's the idea that the real always returns, that you can't completely efface an experience, and that once something becomes part of our memory system, it is always able to return, whether intentionally or unintentionally. But as Lacan stresses, not everything can be represented by thought and by language. And so part of what we discover in analysis is the limitations of our thinking, of our and of language. And Freud even says what dominates in quote unquote primitive culture and in psychotic thinking and in dreams is what he calls the omnipotence of thought. That means that we project our thoughts onto the external world. And so part of what we have to learn through the reality principle is how to separate our thoughts from our perceptions of reality. And so the reality principle is directly tied to the notion of modern reason. And we think about the modern institutions of science and democracy, which caused the break with the pre-modern institutions of religion, feudalism, and monarchy. The, the idea of neutrality is foundational for science and also for democracy. So the scientist is supposed to judge the reality of the world and of their experiments without prejudice, without self-interest. And so the scientist ideally takes a neutral perspective. The same thing with democratic law. The judge is supposed to look at evidence in an impartial way. And so once again, these are necessary but impossible ideals. And they're based on the notion of universality, because if you take a neutral perspective, then you're treating everything in the same way. The same thing when you're free associating, you're not trying to distinguish whether something is a good idea or a bad idea, whether it's moral or immoral, whether it's silly or serious. You're supposed to examine everything with the same open mind. But of course, this is an artificial structure. Psychoanalysis, like the modern world, is based on an artificial structure. But as Descartes argues, the first stage of modern science is to eliminate all prejudice. And this opens up the door for the possibility of empiricism and reality testing. So my overall argument is that it's hard to really talk about psychoanalysis and to apply psychoanalysis if you don't really understand these 5 fundamental threshold concepts. And this applies to both the theory and the practice. And what we find more and more is very few people actually believe in the neutrality of the analyst or in the process of free association. Very few patients actually free associate, and very few analysts maintain the position of neutrality. And also the concept of the unconscious has now been expanded and is no longer tied directly to the notion of repression. And we also have a lack of understanding of the way that the pleasure principle works to shape the human mind and human behavior. So hopefully this has answered or some of your questions. And if you have more questions, please put comments on my YouTube channel. I'm going to post this on YouTube. And then if I get enough questions or criticisms, I'm going to make another video responding to those. So thank you.